Hello, and welcome to today's discussion forum. This is the second of 3 that we are hosting this spring. My name is Lauren Hodson, and I am a member of the Comprehensive Review Task Group, and it is a joy and a pleasure to host this time together today. Thank you all for tuning in, and I want to offer a special thanks for following us away from the live stream page and finding us on YouTube, as we've made a bit of a transition this morning to a different platform. Thank you for your patience and for finding us here, and thank you to those who have so seamlessly helped to make this transition happen. So we're glad that you found us, and we're glad to be together today. Today we're going to have a chance to think about the concept of a college of ministers, one of the concepts that is shared in the Comprehensive Review Task Group discussion paper, Fishing from the Other Side. Like all of the topics that we've discussed so far in these 45-minute discussion forums, this is a huge topic and a huge area. So today is just a time for us to start and continue this conversation, a chance to ask some of the big questions and to spark an ongoing conversation. So hope that you will offer some of your own questions to this time today, and also hope that you will continue the conversation at unitedfuture.ca after our time together today, because of course 45 minutes will just allow us to start a bit of a conversation that it's up to us all to continue. As we think about the College of Ministers, there are some questions, big questions, that we know you're asking, and we've already started to see some of your questions come in on United Future, on Twitter, and on the live stream feed. So I want to encourage you to continue sending in those questions, as today we think about what a College of Ministers might look like in the United Church of Canada, how this concept could provide both support and accountability for ministry personnel, and what we can learn from other initiatives that are already being tested across the church. And to help us all do this, I'm thrilled to have 2 wonderful guests with us here today to offer their thoughts, their questions, and wisdom to the conversation. So with me are Beth Symes and Paul Miller. Beth is a member of the Comprehensive Review Task Group and a longtime United Church member, currently very active at Bloor Street United Church in Toronto. And Beth is a lawyer who practices in the area of employment, constitutional, and human rights law. So welcome, Beth. And Reverend Paul Miller was ordained by Hamilton Conference in 1981. Paul co-chairs the Pastoral Relations Committee of Niagara Presbytery and has extensive experience in pastoral oversight. In July, Paul will become the full-time Presbytery Support Minister in Waterloo Presbytery. So welcome, Paul, and congratulations on that exciting transition. We're really looking forward to hearing from both of you today, and we are really looking forward to hearing from you. So keep sending in those questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can during our time together today. Before we move into our first question, let us just take a moment and center ourselves in prayer. Let us pray. Life-giving God, we are your blessed people. In this time together over time and space, we pray that you might bless us anew. Send your Spirit to meet us here and guide us into your depths that we might glimpse your grace. Help us to hear your songs of praise that fill the world around us, and teach us to sing, to dance with abandon, to rejoice in the wonders of your presence. Lead us in this time and all our times by your Spirit in the pathways of your overflowing peace, hope, and joy. We pray all of this in the name of Jesus, your mystery, your wisdom, your glory. Amen. So Paul, I'm wondering if you could start us off and talk a bit about the current system in the United Church of oversight for ministers and oversight for congregations, kind of the current model of oversight.
Okay, Lauren, I'll try to make something complex fairly simple. Basically, oversight of ministry in the church is viewed as ministry in the church is viewed as a three-way covenant between the minister, the congregation, and the presbytery. And ministers are accountable to the discipline and oversight of the presbytery to which they belong. The presbytery approves calls and transfers. And the presbytery deals with issues and problems and issues around support. And that's usually carried out through a pastoral relations committee. It varies from presbytery to presbytery. Sometimes the pastoral oversight committee takes a greater role, and sometimes presbyteries have different names for the same things. But basically there's a committee of presbytery that's charged with that responsibility. The counterpart to the Pastoral Relations Committee in the congregation is the Ministry and Personnel Committee, and they also play a role in supporting and overseeing and identifying issues with the relationship between the minister and the congregation. And I guess the final piece of that would be that each conference has a personnel minister who doesn't directly have responsibility for oversight, but is a full-time resource and advisor to both clergy and to presbyteries. And I guess the easiest way to think about the personnel minister is that he or she is the minister's minister. So I think all of those pieces come together, but basically oversight is a function of the presbytery.
Thank you. So then, Beth, can you talk to us a bit about the concept of the college as has been outlined in Fishing and the association to oversee and support ministers, and why the Comprehensive Review Task Group is floating this idea to see what folks think?
Sure, Lauren. So let me divide between what is a college and what might be an association. Many of you out there, whether you're teachers or nurses or doctors, belong to a professional organization that licensed you, that oversees your professional practice, and in the unlikely event, disciplines you for misconduct. An association, on the other hand, is an organization, in this case, would be of ministers, by ministers, for ministers. And its functions can vary depending upon what ministers want, from being the voice of ministers in the United Church, to providing community for ministers, to doing continuing education, and even perhaps to advocacy. So ministers would decide whether they wanted an association and what that association would do. So let's talk then first about the college. So what a college would do would be, first of all, qualify persons who want to be ministers. Secondly, it would be responsible for the oversight of ministers, ensuring that requirements are met, either in terms of continuing education, sexual abuse policies, those kinds of things. Third, if there were a complaint about a minister, say a sexual abuse complaint or misappropriation of money, the college would investigate that complaint and, in appropriate cases, hold a formal hearing to determine whether or not misconduct had occurred. So, as Paul described, currently in our church, oversight of ministry, from admission to oversight to discipline, is done by a range of presbyteries and conferences. It takes a huge amount of volunteer time to do this. And sometimes the results are a bit uneven. And so hence, that's why we floated the idea of a college.
Thank you. So, as I listen to you speak, Paul, about our current system and Beth about the idea of a college, I'm hearing some similar echoes of themes of oversight and support, and also a pretty fundamental shift as well. So can you talk a bit about, maybe Paul, you want to start us off, what this fundamental shift in a definition of ministry might look like?
Sure. I want to acknowledge the issues that the Comprehensive Review Task Group have raised, one being the increasing difficulty in fielding the money and human resources to maintain our current system, and also the increasing complexity around complexity of issues around employment. And so I really understand, and the inconsistency as well, from presbytery to presbytery or from conference to conference. I guess the main change that I see in the proposal of the college is not so much an administrative one or a structural one, but it's really a theological one. It's a change in our fundamental understanding of what ministry is. I referred to the three-way covenant between the minister, the congregation, and the presbytery, and it just, it seems to me that the proposal for the college changes that to a self-regulating professional association, so that it's no longer a partnership. That ministry and the oversight of ministry has always belonged to the church. And this seems to me to be shifting it to a profession called ministry, and I think that that's a change that really needs to be thought through fairly carefully, because we have always talked, or we've talked for the last 30 years about trying to restore the concept of ministry to the church as a whole, with certain people being called, trained, set apart, and ordained or commissioned or whatever to carry out particular ministries. But the task of oversight and accountability has always belonged to the church. And this seems to me to be shifting it to a profession, a professional association that sets standards. And I don't see in the comprehensive review, what I've read anyway, that there is any particular oversight of congregations, and presbyteries don't actually oversee ministers. They oversee relationships. They oversee relationships between ministry personnel and either congregations or other presbytery accountable ministers. And so it seems to me that something is really changed, and I think missing from the concept of a college. While I certainly would agree with many of the sentiments that have led to the proposal, and with the importance of many of the functions that the college would serve.
Thank you. So one of the concepts that we'll be taking out to conferences over the coming next few weeks is the relationship of communities of faith, or congregations, broadening that definition, the relationship of communities of faith to the denomination. And one of the big pieces we've been talking about is a theological grounding of covenant in that relationship. So Beth, do you want to respond a bit to this piece of the conversation?
Sure. Thanks, Lauren. So let me again say, this is a college, not an association, and it's not voluntary. What's being proposed in fishing is that every minister would have to be licensed by the college. But although we're using slightly different words and using people in slightly different ways, it's very consistent with our polity. The denomination would remain the entity that establishes what are the pathways to ministry. The denomination would continue to say, in order to be a minister, you must complete A, B, and C. What the college would do would simply say, has Paul met those requirements? And of course, if there's equivalencies, let's say someone who's coming from a different denomination to the United Church, have they met the equivalencies? Have they established that they're competent? Once again, in terms of oversight, it's the denomination that would decide what are the continuing education requirements for ministers each year. What courses must they take in order to remain competent? And all the college would do is ensure that those are done. We already have that discipline is done by both lay people and ministers. That's part of our polity. And we envision that the college would consist of half lay people and half ministers, and that they would sit on committees of the college that would make these determinations. So very much we're continuing what the United Church has always said, that it's a joint product between lay people and ministers in terms of the admission, the oversight, and the discipline of ministers.
Thanks, Beth. So we have a ton of questions coming in here. This is a topic that's really of interest to people. So I'm going to try and get us through as many as we can. One of the questions asks about collegial supervision. So this person's asking, would a college train ministers for collegial supervision so that all ministers would be supervised? And the example given is in the same way that social workers are in a college of social workers. And Beth, you mentioned examples of other professional colleges when you opened us up. So I'm wondering if I could turn to you on this one.
I think that's a fabulous question. As a lawyer, we are grappling with the fact that brand new lawyers get called to the bar and they're not supervised. In fact, they're not even mentored. And so the denomination would decide what kinds of support ministers need. It seems to me, as we've heard from ministers, new ministers would really benefit, in fact enjoy, some form of mentorship, not supervision, but mentorship. And so all of these kinds of things are really topical questions, and those are to be decided by the denomination.
And could function in a college.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It makes perfect sense that, especially in important things like pastoral care or counseling, I think we should learn from social workers and psychologists who are required to have a mentor or someone who reviews with them the difficult cases that they have. This is an idea that we could borrow for ministers from other professions, and this one's excellent.
Thanks, Beth. Do you want to respond, Paul, in terms of collegial support?
Well, I would certainly be supportive of doing a better job at mentoring, supporting clergy and people in accountable ministries, and I think that's probably the weak link in our current system, is that it is highly dependent on. Often, from my experience in pastoral relations, you're really dealing in a very intimate and sometimes quite highly charged way with people who are on the next charge, and many of us, I think, sometimes feel like we're just in a little bit over our heads. So, I mean, that's an aspect that I would certainly be supportive of. I guess I just bring the conversation back, though, to the principle that oversight of ministry is not the same as oversight of ministers, and that I think as we flesh this out, I think that is the piece that needs to be but absolutely, I think that we could do a much better job of supporting clergy who are stressed, clergy who are in trouble, clergy who are feeling isolated, or just finding it's a difficult way to make your living, and I think the need for that is getting greater.
Yeah.
So Lauren, if I could just follow up. In looking over the past 30 years that I've been involved in the church courts, my guess is that we spend about 80% of our time and money trying to support the ministers who are struggling, who are not doing well. And that this is not a particularly effective use of either volunteer time or our scarce resources. We actually need to transfer our care, our support, our money into all ministers to encourage, assist them to become excellent. And so this is a fundamental shift, as opposed to putting all your eggs in the struggling ministers into those that will soar.
Thanks, Beth. So I've heard you both kind of talk on themes of our denominational culture, I think. Both themes of culture that could do with some strengthening, areas of in need of improvement, and also the core of our culture that makes us who we are. So we have a question here that is kind of getting at that cultural piece, I think, asking, is the proposed college about power and control, or is it about ministry and community? So a pretty pointed, direct question about kind of what's at the core of this vision or idea of a college, and also in relation to our current culture in the denomination. Do either of you want to?
Well, let me try. It's always been part of our polity that we are responsible for what our ministers do, and that ministers are accountable to the denomination for their conduct. A college is simply this covenant done slightly differently. It's not a change of principles. We must, in fact, ensure that our ministers are qualified for what they are doing and that they are held accountable for their actions.
Excuse me, I'm not sure that that's I think that's a bit of a false dichotomy. I think in any community, in any relationship, there is the reality of power and how power is exercised. And so I don't think it's a question of whether we're about power and control or about community and, I forget the other term that was used.
Ministry.
Community and ministry. So I think that's a little bit of a false dichotomy. I think the question is, what's the most effective way of exercising the authority that I believe Jesus Christ has given to the church, and the church then entrusts to individuals. What's the best way of doing that? So I'm not sure that that's a really, I don't know if the implication is that a college would be all about control and what we've got now is not. But if that's the implication, I don't think that's a really fair way of framing that. You always have to deal with issues of power and authority. And I think in the church, the really important thing is to deal with those openly, honestly, and transparently, regardless of what structure you have.
Thanks. A question around the relationship between kind of a denominational level of structure and communities of faith or congregations. So this person is asking, so what could the role of a congregational M&P committee be? How would the current function of an M&P committee fit in with a reimagined structure that might include a college?
So there's two specific things. What Fishing proposes is that a community of faith could not hire a minister unless she were licensed by the college. So licensing is mandatory. That ensures a form of quality control to make sure that the person who's going to that community of faith has met the requirements of the denomination on one of the pathways to ministry. The second thing is that if there are serious problems with the minister, let me just say what serious problems might be. Serious problems might be drug addiction, might be sexual abuse of a child, might be misappropriation of money. If serious problems arise in a ministry, then that ministry and personnel committee would be required to report that to the college, so that the college could conduct an independent investigation, and if there are real concerns, then hold a formal hearing. This is exactly the same for teachers, for nurses, for lawyers, etc.
So you've just answered another question that seems to be coming up, is people asking what types of complaints would be plausible in going to a college. What types of complaints might be anticipated? And you've just given a few examples, and I think it's interesting to think of that, as you said before, in terms of the amount of energy that is put into those cases of complaint in relation to the bigger picture. I see you jumping a little. Do you have something to add there, Paul?
Well, I don't know if I have anything specifically to add about that. I think that again, I just want to say that the current proposal seems very complaint-oriented, and that is not the only function that is currently played by, let's say, a pastoral relations committee. That oversight of ministry is not just about those things, and we already do have processes for dealing with sexual abuse, criminal charges, and so on and so forth. So I can see how a college might provide a more efficient way of dealing with those things. But I guess, just to reiterate, I think my concern is that it's dealing with one aspect of oversight and discipline, but there are other aspects that don't seem to be covered. In what I'm reading anyway at the current, state of the documentation. I think that the wild card in all of this is that big amorphous thing called connectional space, and I think a lot of discussion needs to happen around there. That's not just going to be a vacuum, and a lot of discussion needs to happen around what stands between the congregation and the national church or the nationally based college. There's sounds like we're taking away the intermediate levels, but I'm not really sure what's going to stand between the local community of faith and whatever nationally based structures we have, including a college of ministers.
Do you want to offer some thoughts on that, Beth?
Well, let me try something different, is that let's just suppose that a minister gets into difficulty in her community of faith, that there's a personality conflict. And that's not one of the major disputes that I have just outlined. Our current polity is that the minister should go to her presbytery to find support and a way of resolving those problems. And we find ministers tell us that presbyteries aren't actually working all that well in terms of, on the one hand, providing support and oversights for community of faith, and on the other hand, providing support and oversight for the same minister. And so what we would envision in fishing is that the minister who's having difficulties would go to her association, and she would get advice, coaching, and maybe even representation in terms of trying to sort out the problems, which are really personnel problems, human resource problems, as opposed to complaint-driven. And I think that we're not so good at saying this is a personality issue, or this is a poor fit between the minister and the community of faith, as opposed to, oh my gosh, something really serious is going on in which the denomination needs to intervene. And so that's why we see both the college and the association as sort of two necessary things. One, to provide support, collegiality for ministers, and the other, the college, to hold ministers accountable.
So we have a question that's drawing on some of these themes quite nicely in terms of discipline and support. So I think, have been talking quite a bit about areas of discipline and structural assistance that a college type of model could provide and what that currently looks like. Someone is asking, is the purpose of a college only about discipline? That seems to be the focus as they're reading it or hearing us. So could we talk a bit more about the support and lifting up function in a college or as we currently have it?
Yes, to be clear, the college does admission, oversight, and discipline. It is not a support mechanism. It is not a support group. It is the association that provides the support, the encouragement, and potentially the representation of ministers, either with respect to their community of faith or with respect to the college. So they are two very different, very separate functions, and they don't overlap.
Thanks. We have a question that's being passed on. Someone or a few people, it looks like, are wondering would this be complicated because it would require government legislation or approval in all provinces? And Beth, as a lawyer, I'm going to turn this over to you, but I think the short answer is no, because it's the creation of the United Church, not a legislative or governmental creation. Is that
absolutely
get at it there?
Absolutely. Unlike nurses or doctors that are regulated province by province, the United Church of Canada is national in scope, and it can set up its own internal discipline process. And we already have it. It's called the manual.
So a question here around, we've talked quite a bit about college models in other professions. Someone is asking, has the model of a college for ministers been used anywhere else? We know that it works in other disciplines, such as nursing or law, but ministers are different.
The answer is I'm not quite sure. What we do know is that the Unitarian ministers have an association. And you can go on their website. In fact, I encourage you to go on their website because it's really fabulous. It explains what the association says it's going to do for ministers, how it's going to help ministers, and how it makes its decisions. So it's a great model when we're thinking about this idea, and it's existed for a long time. I also understand that the Unitarians do have a board, and we know that there are other denominations that have some sort of a governing board that deals with admissions and oversights and does discipline. But it's not quite as fleshed out. So we've actually looked more closely at the secular model and said, what could we borrow? What's working well there that might fit with our traditions, our polity, and the fact that ministers are in fact called?
And also the structures of other denominations. We spent a lot of time looking at
absolutely.
Other structural denominations to draw that in. Paul, do you have any response?
I have no idea. I mean, in answer to the question, are there other churches that have this model? My response to that is I have no idea. So I don't really have anything to add to that.
Okay. We have a question from Elizabeth Jones on United Future. Is the college about promoting best practices according to standards, or more about emphasizing the potential problems about discipline? And I think we've already
best practices.
Touched upon that.
What a good college does is it asks the professional to be proactive, to assess herself, what her strengths and weaknesses are, and then take the required steps, including continuing education, to build on strengths. And preventive is always the better approach. It's more effective, it's more cost efficient, and it works.
A question around funding and costing. So again, referring folks to our upcoming conference process. One of the 4 topics that we'll be discussing at conferences is around finances and costing, and I'd encourage those of you who are engaged in the conference structure to be part of those conversations, and those of you who might not be, to tune into United Future in coming weeks for a time of conversation, and we'll have an upcoming one of these discussion forums in about a month's time where we can touch more deeply upon some of those topics. But Beth, do you want to quickly just talk about costing in terms of the college model? This person is asking, has anyone costed out what it would take to implement the college?
Yes, we have costed it out. This would be a very small college, about 2,000 members, and when operational, it would take about 5 staff. It's our estimate that it would cost the same or less in terms of money than the current model of oversight and discipline, and that it would be much more efficient and effective. Let me talk then about who would pay for it. It's anticipated that the college would be paid for by the denomination. It's a cost of being a denomination. In contrast, the association would be paid for by ministers. The ministers wouldn't have to belong to the association, but in Canada we have this theory. It's called the RAND formula, which says that all ministers would benefit from the association's activities. So therefore, even though they're not members, they should have to pay for it. How much are ministers prepared to pay? That's up to them to decide. And having decided that, will determine what they do.
Paul, I'm going to turn the next question over to you. This person's saying that they say, I agree that presbyteries aren't working so well with ministry personnel stuff. Why not develop a model that strengthens these regional bodies rather than places all the power in a national body? Do you have a response to that in terms of what strengthening regional bodies could look like?
I think there's a number of directions we could go with that. I personally think that there are nuances and regional variations that it would be very difficult for one single nationally based college to deal with. Although I take the point that the purpose of the college is very specific, and I don't want to kind of muddy those waters, but. Yeah, I mean, it all comes down to resources and the question of whether we can provide the expertise that's required on a regional basis. I would like to say, though, that I don't think it's true that the current system is a complete disaster or that it's broken down in all places. I mean, I happen to think that in Niagara Presbytery, pastoral relations is working pretty well. Nobody will admit that because everybody always wants to blame Presbytery for everything. But I think one thing we could do is look at presbyteries where things are working well and see what we can learn from them. And likewise conferences. I know it's very difficult in extremely geographically large and presbyteries with a small number of congregations to make this model work. So I think it's a matter of looking at our available resources and deploying them in the best way. But I would certainly be in favor of doing whatever we can to make the current system more workable. And we need to look at what our presbyteries are doing and what their best practices are and build on those.
One of the themes that seems to be coming out of all of these discussion forums, I think, is this nuanced tension, as you say, Paul, between kind of regional differences or regional specificities, and also being part of a church that is called to be one body with many different parts to it. And that was one thing that really struck me coming out of our last discussion forum a few weeks ago around property, and how there seemed to be this really strong call from those gathered and in conversation in that forum around the role of the whole church as a body to lift up one another and the shared responsibility that comes with that. So I mean, as you say, looking at places where things are working well and lifting those up as a community, as a church, and at the same time this need to recognize regional differences and provide a bit of consistency, I think, is quite the tension that many of these topics are really grappling with, including this one of the college.
Can I just say that I think that regardless of what happens with the comprehensive review, that's essential, because we've had a number of attempts over the last 30 years to reorganize the church. And because of our decision-making structure and our remit process, I mean, I don't think we can assume that the hard work of the comprehensive review task group is going to achieve the consensus necessary. So, we may in fact be left with what we've got, and we'll have to find a way of making that work one way or another. So, I mean, I think I don't think that's something that can just be kind of put on hold until we see what happens with the comprehensive review. I think we've always got to be assuming that we're going to be working with the structure we've got and how we can make that better.
Do you want to respond?
Well, I'm certainly hoping that the recommendations the Comprehensive Review Task Group makes to General Council 42 will be adopted. But as Paul says, it's going to take several years for those to roll out. And we need, in the meantime, that our current structures be as vibrant and as strong as possible, because I'm going to continue to go to church, and we're going to continue to have new ministers, and hopefully we will continue to do mission, and all of that's going to continue no matter what our structure is.
So one of the places where we really see this happening is there are many current projects that are going on in the church, really wonderful projects that look at many of the streams that we're touching upon in some ways as the Comprehensive Review Task Group and in our work across the church. All of us are touching with, but that many of these projects, for example, the Effective Leadership Project, how do we learn from one another and lift up these best practices? So one of the questions here kind of gets on this in terms of some of the work that's currently happening in other places in the church with other bodies, and some of what we're talking about. This person's asking, so would this model include all accountable staff or only ordained folks, like a director of Christian education? What about other professional staff, like music directors, DLMs? So touching upon some of the streams of ministry questions. Beth, do you want to answer that one a little bit?
Sure. I mean, it's possible to have the college look at everyone. I think what's more everyone who's employed in the church. But I think what's more reasonable is those who are in ministry, and ministry being defined by the denomination. And right now, there are numerous pathways to ministry that could well continue. And the denomination gets to decide. The college would implement that, so that there's no difference in terms of denomination. I would like to say that I'm really impressed by the work of the Effective Leadership. These are various pilot projects that are being rolled out differently in different conferences, and it's still a process, an ongoing process. It'll be assessed sometime in 2015. I think what's so exciting about effective leadership is, first of all, daring to be different, daring to do oversight and discipline differently, and we haven't fallen apart. We can, in fact, still be a church and depart from what was done in 1925. We just have to have courage.
Thanks. So I think we have time for one last question here. Someone's saying, I'm concerned about having a centralized body responsible for admissions, discipline, and especially oversight from coast to coast. So getting back to some of those regional and denominational, national tensions that we were talking about. Do either of you want to comment on that?
Well, let me just say is that in terms of representation on the board of the college, it is anticipated, remember 50% are lay people, 50% are ministers, that they would be regionally represented from coast to coast to coast, and that they would also be representative of the different pathways to ministry, whether it's ordained, diaconal, or designated lay, that the college would have to encompass all of those. And so therefore, what is the college to do? Well, it's to do admission. Well, there's just one standard across Canada. There are different pathways, but they're the same pathway whether you're in Newfoundland or you're in British Columbia. It's the same pathways. What about the standards for ministers? Gosh, we've got exactly the same standards. It'd be kind of bad if we had different ethical standards in BC than we did in Quebec, and that's not true. We have national standards. And similarly, we have the same standards with respect to discipline. That is, it is wrong to sexually abuse a child, and it is wrong and inconsistent with ministry to misappropriate money. So at this level, we are at national standards. And so therefore, having a regionally represented college of both lay people and ministers is consistent with our polity and doesn't really affect regionalism.
Paul, do you want to comment on this?
Well, I guess change is always the exchanging of one set of problems for another. And so, I would just encourage the task group to, while the proposal for the college introduces efficiencies and consistency, I just encourage us to think about what the college will not, what the proposed new system will not be able to provide that's currently being provided, which is more locally based, context-based, nuanced support and encouragement and oversight. So, I mean, you can't come up with a structure that's going to solve every issue. And so, I would just encourage those who are working on this to be attentive to what may be lost as well as what may be gained, and move ahead with those things in mind.
Thank you. And I would encourage all of you to be engaged in this conversation as well, letting us know what some of this might look like, how that would be fleshed out in your current context. What are some of the concerns or outstanding things that you would like us to hear, and as a church, us to talk about and address. This is our process as a church, and so I hope that you'll continue the conversation, today's conversation on the college, which can be continued at unitedfuture.ca, as well as many of the other conversations that are happening across the church. This is a chance for us to engage deeply and meaningfully as people of faith. So I want to thank you so much for tuning in today. There has been such fabulous conversation, a vibrancy in the live stream discussion feed today that I think has really stimulated this conversation, brought a lot of questions, a lot of ideas, and a lot of things for us to keep talking about. And I want to thank you both for joining us. It's been a real great pleasure to spend time with you today and kind of dig more deeply into some of these questions and ask more questions as well. So thank you very much.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Keep the questions coming.
Definitely. And I also want to invite you all to tune in to our third discussion forum that's happening this spring. That will be taking place on June 12th. At the same time, you can find it on unitedfuture.ca. And this next forum will be a bit of a ask us anything type of open space, a chance for a comprehensive review task group update, a chance to share a bit about what we've been hearing, and also a time to answer any questions that are outstanding for you. So I hope that you will join myself as well as Kathy Hamilton, the Comprehensive Review Task Group Chair, and Kenji Marui, who always has something witty to share. Hope that you'll join the three of us on June 12th at 12 o'clock Eastern Time, and I look forward to that time. And in the meantime, thank you so much, and we'll see you online at unitedfuture.ca.